While most people and businesses suffer through lots of pain from the pandemic, not every company or everyone has gone hurting. Now, companies that were able to get products to consumers through home delivery, they did very well. And one company, Amazon, they did better than anybody else. Amazon's success turned into an even rosier pandemic for Amazon owner Jeff Bezos. Now, the numbers so big, let's just look at Amazon's numbers for the first 3 months of this calendar year. Amazon did more than $108 billion in sales in the first quarter. As a frame of reference, that's a 44% increase over the same period in 2020. And Amazon's profits were also huge, more than $8 billion, again, for the first quarter this year. That's an increase of 220% over the year prior. Now, the pandemic has also helped cement owner Jeff Bezos' place as the wealthiest person in the world. His net worth at the end of 2020 was pegged at about $186 billion, $70 billion of which he just added during 2020. But Amazon made all those sales and all that money amid growing complaints about the company, that it uses unfair monopolistic practices to squash its competition, that it underpays and overworks employees, especially in its growing network of massive warehouses, and amid complaints from workers about conditions and squashing attempts of workers to try to unionize. And for more on Amazon, its success, and the seemingly never-ending string of complaints and concerns with it, let's bring in Alec MacGillis. Alec covers government and politics for ProPublica, and he is author of the book Fulfillment: Winning and Losing in One-Click America, which is about the giant online retailer. And, you know, Alec, I'll admit I'm a dinosaur. Even in my own household, I'm about the only one who doesn't buy everything online right now. But I had always thought that somehow Amazon was the inevitable through line from, you know, the mom and pop to the big box store to finally something online. But I got to tell you, when you go through the book, there's no read of this where the better Amazon does, the better America does. It's almost at opposite interests, even if that wasn't the intention.
Exactly right. I mean, you really saw that so starkly this past year, where we as a nation just had, and as a society, had such a dreadful year in this year of the pandemic. And it was just such an extraordinarily good year for Amazon, to a degree that's really kind of hard to capture. The numbers are just through the roof. And so, you know, the old saying that, you know, what's good for GM is good for America, it's just very, very hard to, that was, you know, questionable at the time, even in that context, but it's very hard to even to think of what's been going on with Amazon in those terms. I mean, 50% growth nearly 50% growth in sales this past year, 50% growth in warehouse space to handle the surge, 400,000 more employees, Bezos' personal wealth up $58 billion. The company's stock almost doubling, just an extraordinary surge in growth and success for this company in a year that was just one of the worst that this company has ever, that this country has ever experienced.
You know, Alec, I remember a debate, and we're broadcasting from not far from New York City, where Amazon was thinking about having one of its major hubs in New York and in Queens, and there was pushback. And I thought the opposition to it was so naive in terms of the jobs that it would have created, the revenue would have brought, and the rest. And I got to admit, in reading your book, and the concentration of where the money really goes, not the $10-hour jobs that don't really, you know, have any kind of livable wage for most of these folks, but it's a concentration. And you say in your book that in many ways it's changed the geography of this country. And again, whether that was the intention or not isn't the point. Whether it's the Seattles or the Washington, D.C.s, the money gets concentrated in there. And if you're in the hinterlands, you don't see any of this.
No, you really don't. And that's really what my book started out being all about, actually, was this regional disparity, regional inequality, these concentrations of wealth that are so unhealthy for both sorts of city. They're unhealthy for the left behind places that are now dealing with just, you know, depopulation and depression and decline as all this money and commerce is kind of sucked out of them. But it's also not healthy for the winner cities, the winner-take-all cities like Seattle and DC and New York, San Francisco, Boston, that are left with just this, you know, incredible housing costs, dystopian levels of wealth and inequality. And so everything's kind of out of whack in that sense. And so much of it has to do with the concentration of our economy in certain companies. That you have, one reason you have such a concentration of wealth in certain places in this country is that you have such a concentration of the economy in certain companies. Those two things are closely intertwined. And that's what the book, one of the things that the book is hoping to get across.
And you think that it's led to, in fact, maybe even played a decent sized role in the fact that those two different parts of the country are growing more and more unfamiliar with one another. We don't speak the same language in many ways, forget about thinking the same things, watching the same channels. Part of it has been, this cleaving about where the money's going and where it's not.
Absolutely. You end up with just these utterly different realities in the two different sorts of places. And then you also end up with deep resentment in the sort of left behind places. And that resentment has played such a role in our politics. That resentment is not separate from other things. It's not separate from, say, the sort of racial, racist, xenophobic elements that Donald Trump sort of helped into our politics a few years ago. But it's closely intertwined with them. It helps to explain why that kind of politics becomes more powerful. It's the economic factors don't excuse those other kind of strains. They in a sense have kind of weaponized them and made them more powerful and sort of toxic in our politics.
And so much of this book isn't so much about the inner workings of Amazon, although it covers it, but it's really the consequences. I'm curious, how much of this idea that Bezos had for this was born out of, hey, this is going to be a convenience here. This is going to be much more efficient on the consumer. They'll even save a few bucks, to the point that it was always intended to be a necessity that, at a certain point you couldn't avoid, clicking to buy a purchase, and you weren't going to step into a store. Was that always the plan, to reach the scope that we've gotten to, or is that just, in the case of Bezos, just a convenient consequence?
He always had these very, very grand ambitions for it. That was the whole notion of calling it Amazon. He wanted a name that conveyed that kind of grandeur and scope and aggressiveness. But you make such a good point about the sort of unavoidability of it now, that it's gotten to this point now where that convenience feeds on itself, because the more we kind of make that one purchase because it's more convenient than going 5 miles down the road or 5 blocks down the road, we then drive out those other competitors. Those local brick and mortar businesses go out of business, and then a year from now, 2 years from now, the choice is, do I buy this thing, or I have to go 10 miles or 20 miles down the road to get it? So it becomes actually even harder to turn down the one-click option, because it has now become more convenient just because everything else has fallen away. So there's a real vicious cycle to this.
And this did not happen overnight, although the velocity and growth of Amazon's amazing. A lot of it had to do with lobbying. A lot of it had to do with a whole host of different reasons, including, missed opportunities to curtail, if not even the growth, to at least make it more equitable. But I'm curious, for folks who don't know, Alec's not just an author. He's one of the more noted reporters, including a lot of investigative work. And we all know in our business that when Bezos bought the Washington Post, people, said prayers answered. And to be fair, he's put a lot of money into keeping that as to one of the great papers around. How much slack do you think many of us have given him as a consequence for that, in that he kept around great journalism, investigative journalism, critical here, when so many papers were shuttering? And how much of that do you think has led to the pass that he's gotten?
I think it played a big role, for sure. I think what we have to keep in mind about his purchase of the Washington Post is that while there was a philanthropic, charitable element to it, no question, sort of some kind of civic notion to it, that was also part of a huge building up of Amazon's profile in Washington, D.C., where right now the company's biggest threat resides. The company's biggest threat is not other companies, other corporate rivals. The company's biggest threat is the threat of federal intervention. So it's no accident that he's bought the newspaper in Washington.
Do you think if you and I sit down in 5 years, I know you reported that there's 800,000 just domestic workers for Amazon, that we're going to be talking about Amazon with this skyrocket growth? Or do you think the government's going to say, wait a second, this is cannibalization. This is not healthy here. Somebody's got to rein this thing in. It's already gotten too big. Which direction do you think is more likely?
This is what's going to be decided really in the next year or two. There's a big fight looming right now in Washington on this very subject, and there are signs that it's going to be a real fight. That the Biden administration is taking this seriously. It's made some appointments that suggest it is concerned about this. There are people in Congress, actually in both parties, that are talking a lot about this. We'll see if just how kind of sincere those efforts turn out to be. But this is really one of the biggest fights now looming in Washington around this subject, not just with Amazon, but with the other tech giants too. We are, in a sense, arriving at a moment not unlike what we had in the early 20th century with the monopolies and near monopolies of the Gilded Age. And it's now time to essentially confront that again. And it'll determine whether in a few years we're looking at them with 2 million employees and even more warehouses. They announced just today that they're hiring 75,000 more people, just like that.
Amazing. The book, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. Alec MacGillis, really a really interesting and timely read. Thank you very much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
And up next, the scenes out of Israel and Palestine, horrible to see. It's also popping up more and more in our domestic politics in some seriously wrong and insulting ways. More on both of that after this.